He lost his wife and sealed his heart forever. But his father thinks he can pay someone to make him happy again. What happens next will wow you. Hello everyone, welcome to this fascinating movie journey with us. Get ready as we bring you the full gist about this interesting Nigerian movie, filled with hidden morals and exciting life lessons that we are going to reveal today. Don't go anywhere, grab your popcorn and enjoy the ride with us. Make sure to subscribe because we have lots of exciting movie goodies coming your way. Without further ado, let's get started. Lisa, facing societal pressure, arrived at the mansion of a retired military officer. She told the gateman she wanted to see his boss, but her tone was rude. The gateman informed the military guards that Lisa was asking for their boss, and they allowed her into the house. Inside Mr. Declan's sitting room, while Lisa waited for him, she started feeling scared and uncomfortable seeing a uniformed man standing beside her. She decided to leave, but the military guard didn't allow her. Then, Mr. Declan came out with his housekeeper, Nancy, and asked Lisa what she wanted. Lisa greeted him and told him she was his son's girlfriend. She then made an offer. Either Mr. Declan gives her 2 million naira and she will leave his son alone, or she won't leave him at all. Mr. Declan then told Nancy to call his son Scott. She went to his room and informed him that his father needed his attention. Scott later came to the sitting room, and his father told him that Lisa claimed to be his girlfriend. Scott then turned to Lisa and asked if it was a prank and where the hidden camera was. He then told his father that he didn't know her at all. Realizing she was in trouble, Lisa tried to apologize. The military guard took her outside to punish her, but Scott told them to let her go. Lisa then told Scott she was just trying her luck, blaming her actions on a Korean movie she had watched, where she had seen a similar scene. Scott warned her never to return to his house. As Lisa was leaving, she suddenly remembered she had forgotten her bag inside the house and wanted to go back for it, but she was chased out of the compound. Nancy, still talking to Mr. Declan about Lisa's audacity to claim Scott as her boyfriend, noticed Lisa's forgotten bag. She picked it up and gave it to Mr. Declan. Later that night, Lisa was seen sleeping outside when her younger sister, Jane, woke her up and they went inside the house. While they were eating, Lisa shared what had happened to her earlier that day. Jane told Lisa she shouldn't have done that. Frustrated, Lisa explained that she was desperate for money and had been job hunting for 2 months without success. Losing her appetite, she walked away. Meanwhile, back at Scott's place, Hannah, a lady Scott had a fling with, came to see him. He wasn't pleased and acted cold toward her. He bluntly told her that he hadn't invited her and reminded her that what they had was a mistake on his part. Hannah tried to seduce Scott, but he didn't fall for it and told her to leave. Hannah started expressing her feelings for Scott, but instead of responding, he just stared at her, then walked away, leaving her heartbroken and in tears. Meanwhile, Lisa was still outside the house, deep in thought, when Jane came to call her inside. Lisa, feeling frustrated and overwhelmed, spoke in a distressed manner. Jane became sad watching her sister struggle emotionally. Lisa then apologized, and they went inside to sleep. The next morning, Lisa returned to Scott's house to retrieve her bag, but the gateman didn't allow her in. Scott then instructed him to open the gate. Lisa entered and went straight to the sitting room to look for her bag under Scott's supervision, but she couldn't find it. Scott walked toward Lisa and asked what her plan was in the first place by coming back to his house. Looking straight into his eyes, Lisa told him, "You can't intimidate me, and I won't leave until I get my bag." Then Mr. Declan, Scott's father, came out and told Scott to let Lisa be. So, Scott went out. Mr. Declan then handed Lisa's bag to her. As she was about to leave, Mr. Declan asked her to sit down and asked how much she needed. Lisa told him she needed 5 million naira and explained in detail what she needed the money for. Mr. Declan then offered to give her the money, but only if she worked for him for at least 6 months. Lisa agreed. What would you do if you were in Lisa's shoes? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. Later that same day, Jane came back from work, and Lisa told her about Mr. Declan's offer. Jane couldn't believe it because it sounded too good to be true. But Lisa assured her that nothing bad would happen to her. A few days later, Lisa went to see Mr. Declan at Scott's house. As she was entering, she saw Scott at the entrance, about to leave. He looked at her and said she must have a death wish for coming to his house. Lisa quickly told him that his father had requested her presence. Scott then warned her to be very careful, got into his car, and drove off while Lisa went inside. Inside the house, Mr. Declan joined Lisa in the sitting room with the help of Nancy because he was in a wheelchair. Noticing that Lisa looked unhappy, he asked what was wrong. Lisa sincerely told him that Scott was mean to her for no reason. Mr. Declan took a deep breath and simply said, "Pain." Curious, Lisa sat down and asked him what had happened to Scott. Mr. Declan then shared that Scott had lost his wife during the war, and since then, he had not been himself. He admitted that he was still worried about Scott because he wanted him to be happy and eventually get married. Hearing this, Lisa was left speechless. Later that evening, Lisa was back home eating with Jane. She told her about what Mr. Declan had revealed about Scott and admitted that she felt bad for him. Jane then asked, "What if Scott ends up liking you?" Lisa looked at her and replied, "Things don't happen that way." The next day, Mr. Declan informed Nancy that she would no longer be in charge of the house chores because Lisa would be taking over. As they were talking, Scott walked in and asked if he was interrupting anything, to which Mr. Declan replied, "No." The next morning, Jane saw Lisa off as she would be resuming work at Scott's house that day. When Lisa arrived, Nancy showed her to her room and informed her that Mr. Declan wanted to see her after she had fully rested. Then, Nancy stepped out. An hour later, Lisa met with Mr. Declan, who gave her some documents to sign. He explained that he was old-fashioned and preferred having documented agreements. Without reading the document, Lisa signed it. Later that evening, Scott returned from work and was shocked to see Lisa in his house. He asked what she was doing there, and Lisa casually told him that she was the new housekeeper. Unable to believe what he had just heard, Scott laughed and walked away. The next day, Scott returned home early and was surprised to find Hannah in his room. Immediately, he asked what she was doing there. She told him she wanted to make their relationship work and believed that, over time, Scott would love her back. While they were still talking, Lisa came to ask Scott if he needed anything before she retired to bed. Instead of answering directly, he looked at her and asked, "What's your end game in becoming a maid in my house?" Lisa stood her ground and firmly replied, "I know my worth." Scott scoffed and told her, "I don't think you do. This house will ruin you." He then told her he didn't need anything and slammed the door behind her. The next morning, Lisa prepared breakfast, and Mr. Declan was already eating when Scott and Hannah joined him at the dining table. Hannah greeted Mr. Declan and then announced that she was leaving. Lisa asked if she wouldn't be staying for breakfast, but Hannah declined and left. Lisa then turned to Scott and asked if he would like to be served breakfast. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Bring my food." Do you think Lisa made the right decision by working for Mr. Declan? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. Later that same day, Lisa was doing the dishes in the kitchen while on a call with Jane, gisting about how cold-hearted Scott was to Hannah. She said she couldn't imagine being with someone like Scott, not knowing that Scott had overheard her conversation. He walked up to her, startling her, and told her to mind her business in the house. Later on, Lisa went to arrange Scott's room and brought out his dirty clothes to wash. Nancy came in and informed Lisa that she could use the washing machine, but Lisa told her it would ruin the clothes she wanted to wash, Scott's military uniform. Nancy then started a conversation, asking if Scott was difficult to deal with. Lisa looked at her, but said nothing. Nancy went on to say that Scott used to be a lively person, and that she believed he was slowly becoming that person again. Then she went back into the house. That evening, Scott entered his room and saw his clothes washed, ironed, and neatly arranged on his bed. He called Lisa in and asked why she had washed his clothes when he hadn't asked her to. Lisa simply told him that it was her job. She added, "It's the little things that matter." Scott was taken aback by her words. He repeated them to himself and then told Lisa that someone close to him used to say the same thing. He thanked her, and she left his room. That same night, Hannah came to see Scott again, but he left the room for her and went to the sitting room. There, he saw Lisa watching a program on TV. She was about to stand up, but Scott told her to continue what she was doing. Lisa then asked if he needed anything, and he said no. After a moment, Scott asked if she would like to have a drink with him, but Lisa politely declined. Scott then joined her to watch the program and asked what it was about. Lisa explained it to him. The next morning, Hannah walked into the kitchen and told Lisa to leave the cooking to her and go do other chores. Lisa humbly left and went to the sitting room, where she found Scott sleeping on the couch. She woke him up and told him she needed to clean. Scott, still drowsy, told her she was disturbing his sleep and should go prepare breakfast. That's when Lisa told him that Hannah was already making breakfast. Scott was not happy about this. He immediately called Hannah out and started shouting at her. Hannah began crying, and Lisa, unable to take it anymore, spoke up. She told Scott not to talk to or treat a lady like that because he was belittling her. Mr. Declan and Nancy witnessed everything. Scott glanced at them, then walked away to his room. Lisa, realizing she might have overstepped, apologized to Mr. Declan, but he told her it was okay and that Scott deserved it. Someone needed to put him in his place. He then asked Lisa to get him a cup of tea. The next day, Scott returned from an outing, and Lisa told him she had made yam porridge. Scott asked why she had chosen to make that, and Lisa explained that she had found out it was his favorite food. She served him, then apologized for how she had spoken to him the previous day. Scott took a bite and complimented her cooking skills. Lisa smiled and mentioned that yam porridge was also her sister's favorite food. Scott paused for a moment and said it had also been his late wife's favorite. Lisa hesitated before asking what had happened to his wife. Scott then shared how he had lost her during the war and how, ever since she died, he had felt an emptiness in his heart. Lisa felt sorry for him. Later, Lisa went to her room and called Jane to talk about Scott. She admitted she felt bad for him, but still thought he was rude. The next day, Scott was having some wine in the sitting room when Lisa walked in. He invited her to join him. She refused at first, but later gave in. They ended up drinking the whole bottle, getting intoxicated, and eventually ended up in his room. The next morning, Lisa got dressed and quietly left Scott's room. She went to the sitting room, where Mr. Declan was waiting. He looked at her and smiled, telling her that she was glowing. Then, he added that he was aware of her little escapades with Scott the previous night. Lisa was shocked and quickly told him, "It's not what you think." Mr. Declan then told Lisa that this was what he had wanted all along, for Scott to get close to her so she could earn her money. Lisa replied that earning her money was the only reason she was working for him. Scott overheard this conversation and misunderstood it, thinking his father had paid Lisa to be with him. He became furious. Later that day, Lisa went into Scott's room and noticed his cold demeanor. She asked if he was okay, but Scott told her he had overheard her conversation with his father and believed she had been paid to sleep with him. He said he was disappointed in her. Lisa tried to explain, but he didn't listen. He told her to leave the house, and she left. Still fuming, Scott went to confront his father, accusing him of trying to manipulate him. He said hurtful words that brought tears to Mr. Declan's eyes, but Scott didn't care. He simply walked away. Lisa was back to square one, crying in her room with Jane beside her. Jane hugged her to comfort her. Just then, Lisa received a message on her phone. It was a credit alert for the 5 million naira Mr. Declan had promised. She immediately told Jane that she wanted to return the money, but Jane disagreed, saying Lisa had worked for it and couldn't just send it back. She reminded Lisa of the business they had planned to start with the money. Lisa, however, remained firm. She promised Jane that they would raise the money themselves. Meanwhile, Nancy approached Scott to tell him that his father was sorry for what had happened, but Scott didn't want to hear it and walked away. The next day, Jane took the money and returned it to Mr. Declan through Scott. Scott took the money to his father and told him that Lisa had returned it. He then added, "It looks like your money can't buy Lisa." A few days later, Lisa was going through some documents in her wardrobe, lost in thought. Meanwhile, Scott was in his room, also deep in thought. Some days passed, and Scott went to see Hannah. He apologized for how badly he had treated her, and she forgave him. They became friendly again. That same day, Scott spotted Lisa working as a POS agent from his car, but he didn't have the courage to approach her. Later that evening, he returned home and joined his father and Nancy for dinner. The next morning, Lisa and Jane were sitting outside their room when Lisa asked Jane how much she had saved so far. Jane told her she had saved 150,000 naira. Lisa smiled and said she had saved up to 200,000 naira. They were both happy with their progress. Just then, Lisa received a phone call. Her expression turned to shock and happiness, and she quickly hugged Jane. The next day, Lisa and Jane were walking down the street when Scott spotted them and honked. He stepped out of his car and invited them to join him. At first, they refused, but after some hesitation, they got in. As Scott drove, Lisa suddenly realized something. She turned to him and said, "I never told you where I was going. How did you know?" At that moment, she connected the dots. Scott was behind the phone call she had received the previous day. She immediately asked him to stop the car. Scott pulled over, and Lisa and Jane stepped out. It was revealed that Lisa had received a scholarship to a culinary school with Scott's help. But instead of being grateful, Lisa told him she didn't want anything from him. She and Jane walked away, but Scott followed them to their house, pleading with Lisa to accept the scholarship. Lisa, however, refused. "I don't want anything from you," she said firmly. "You really hurt me. Should Lisa forgive Scott and accept the scholarship, or is she right to walk away? Share your thoughts." Scott apologized to Lisa and sincerely expressed his feelings for her, saying she had similar traits to his late wife. Seeing his sincerity, Lisa accepted his apology. The next day, Scott took Lisa to his house, and Mr. Declan welcomed her with open arms. Lisa then followed Nancy into the kitchen to prepare a meal for everyone. Later that evening, Scott and Lisa took a walk by the beach, reassuring each other of the love they shared. We've come to the end of this beautiful movie. Thank you for joining us in this exciting episode. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notification bell for more interesting and fascinating episodes like this. Till we meet again, goodbye.
Thank you.